Karen Goodson, our HOA president, sued to force us into her regime, claiming our land was hers. She waved a 30-year-old map and slapped us with $9,000 in fines for violations like having trees. But in 3 minutes, her entire case imploded in court. This is how we annihilated a petty tyrant's fraud empire. Strap in, you've never seen an HOA takedown like this. Comment below and let me know where you're watching this story from. The first time I saw Karen, she marched up my driveway like she owned it. Karen rocked up in pink power suit armor, wielding a lawsuit like a scepter. Her eyes raked our fire pit, our trees, like a dictator inspecting conquered land. The Georgia sun was beating down mercilessly as I worked on my latest project, a handcrafted oak chest that would probably end up on some rich family's mantle after they bought it online. 2 years of saving, a year of blood and sweat, we turned 5 wild acres into our sanctuary. No traffic, no Karens, until she arrived. The lake sparkled behind my modest cabin, reflecting the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. 3 generations of Harrisons had called this place home, and I'd be damned if I was going to be the one to break that chain. The sound of expensive tires on gravel broke my concentration, and I looked up to see a pristine white BMW pulling into my driveway. Out stepped Patricia Whitmore, HOA president of Lake Vista Estates, dressed in a white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly income. She picked her way across the muddy yard in stiletto heels, looking as comfortable as a penguin in a swamp. I'd seen her around the neighborhood for the past few years, always with that superior smile and clipboard, making life miserable for anyone who dared to plant the wrong color flowers. Today, though, there was something different in her eyes, something harder and more calculating than usual HOA drama. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I represent the Lake Vista Estates Homeowners Association, and we have what I believe will be a very lucrative development opportunity for you. My investors, some very successful businessmen from Eastern Europe, are extremely interested in this particular piece of lakefront real estate. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for the immediate sale and transfer of deed." The offer hung in the air like a bad joke. $50,000 for land that was worth at least $300,000, maybe more, with the lake access and the recent development boom in the area. I set down my chisel and looked at her with the kind of patience you reserve for children and people who think they're smarter than they are. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level and polite, "this land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather died protecting it during the Depression, and my father spent his whole life working to keep it. I'm not interested in selling, regardless of the price." Her smile faltered for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something cold and dangerous beneath her suburban soccer mom facade. She recovered quickly, though, switching tactics with the smooth efficiency of a practiced manipulator. "Mr. Harrison, I understand the sentimental value. Truly, I do, but you have to think practically about your future. The community needs progress and your current situation. This little cottage and workshop setup simply doesn't fit with our vision for the area." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and I had to admire her technique even as my blood started to simmer. She was good at this, knowing exactly which buttons to push and how much pressure to apply without crossing any obvious lines. But what she didn't know was that I'd been dealing with manipulative sociopaths long before she'd ever thought about playing suburban power games. "I've got all my permits and paperwork in order," I replied calmly, gesturing toward the cabin. "You're welcome to review them if you'd like. Everything here is completely legal and up to code." Her composure cracked a little more, and I could see frustration creeping into her expression. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't just about community standards or property values. There are ways to make people comply with necessary changes, legal ways that can make life very difficult for those who refuse to cooperate. Zoning violations, environmental inspections, building code enforcement, the kinds of problems that can drag on for years and cost far more than you'd ever make from this little hobby business of yours." She gestured dismissively at my workshop and tools, and I felt that familiar cold anger settling in my chest. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Syria. This was suburban Georgia. and Patricia Whitmore was about to learn that some veterans weren't as helpless as they appeared. I stood up slowly, stretching to my full height and letting her see the kind of physical conditioning that didn't come from weekend gym sessions. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, my voice carrying just enough edge to let her know the conversation was about to change direction. "I appreciate your concern for the community, but like I said, I'm not interested in selling. This is my home, and it's going to stay that way." Her face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, and she fumbled for her phone with the jerky movements of someone who wasn't used to being dismissed by people she considered beneath her social status. As she dialed, I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, peeking over her fence with the eager expression of someone who'd found the best entertainment in weeks. Dolores Henderson was 72 years old and had been the unofficial neighborhood commentator for longer than anyone could remember. "Oh boy," she called out cheerfully. "Looks like we're about to have ourselves some real drama. You know, Patricia, that Marcus fellow has been nothing but polite in the 2 years he's been here." Patricia shot her a withering look, but Mrs. Henderson just grinned and settled in to watch the show. "Fine," Patricia snapped into her phone. "If that's how you want to play this game, then we'll do it the hard way. I'm calling the police right now. They can explain your legal obligations in terms you might understand better." The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched her demand immediate police response for what she described as threats and intimidation from a potentially dangerous individual. What she didn't know was that this little lakefront property wasn't just the Harrison family homestead. It was also perfect bait for exactly the kind of predator I'd been hunting for longer than she could imagine. But Karen wasn't done. The next attack would cross a line even I couldn't ignore. "Mr. Harrison," she said with poisonous sweetness, "I think you're going to regret this decision. The police will be here shortly, and I'm quite certain they'll be able to help you understand the reality of your situation." 2 patrol cars rolled up my driveway 15 minutes later, sirens wailing like Karen had called in a hostage situation instead of a property dispute. She stood there with her arms crossed, looking like a prosecutor waiting for a guilty verdict, while I continued sanding my oak chest as if armed police showing up at my house was just another Tuesday afternoon. Detective Riley Brooks stepped out of the first car, a solid guy in his early 40s who carried himself with a kind of confidence that came from years of dealing with suburban drama. His partner, Officer Martinez, looked younger and more eager, probably hoping for some real action after a morning of traffic tickets and noise complaints. Karen immediately launched into her performance, pointing at me like I was some kind of dangerous criminal who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice pitched just right to sound like a concerned citizen instead of a manipulative control freak. "This man has been threatening me, refusing to comply with legitimate HOA regulations, and I have reason to suspect he may be involved in illegal activities. I've seen strange people coming and going at all hours, and there's been suspicious noises coming from his workshop." I had to admire her creativity, turning my late-night woodworking sessions and the occasional visit from my VA counselor into evidence of criminal behavior. Brooks looked from Karen to me, his expression neutral but professional, clearly trying to assess the situation before jumping to any conclusions. Martinez had his hand resting casually on his radio, ready to call for backup if things went sideways, but I could tell neither of them was particularly worried about the middle-aged guy with sawdust on his shirt. "Sir," Brooks said, addressing me directly, "we need to ask you a few questions and take a look around the property to address these concerns. Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation?" His tone was respectful but firm, the kind of approach that worked well with most people who weren't criminals. I set down my sandpaper and nodded, gesturing toward the cabin with the easy cooperation of someone who had nothing to hide. "Of course, officer. My house is open, and you're welcome to check anything you'd like. I've got all my permits and paperwork organized in a folder by the front door." Karen's confident expression flickered slightly as we started the tour, probably because she was realizing that my property was exactly what it appeared to be, a well-maintained home workshop belonging to someone who took pride in following the rules. We walked through the cabin methodically, Brooks taking notes while Martinez checked corners and cabinets with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this routine 1,000 times before. Everything was legal, clean, and organized. From my collection of woodworking tools to the small arsenal of hunting rifles properly secured in a gun safe, my disability paperwork was neatly filed, my business license for custom furniture was current, and my property taxes were paid up to date. The only thing remotely suspicious was how meticulously everything was arranged, but that could easily be explained by military habits and the kind of obsessive-compulsive tendencies that help some veterans cope with civilian life. Karen kept pushing for them to dig deeper, insisting that I was hiding something dangerous. But her credibility was starting to wear thin as the evidence failed to support her dramatic accusations. "Ma'am," Brooks said finally, turning back to Karen with barely concealed irritation. "We've conducted a thorough inspection, and everything here appears to be completely legitimate. Mr. Harrison has been cooperative and transparent, and we haven't found any evidence to support your claims." But Karen wasn't ready to give up yet, and I could see her calculating her next move with the desperate creativity of someone whose carefully laid plans were falling apart. "Officer, I demand that you search him personally. He could be carrying weapons or drugs, and I refuse to feel unsafe in my neighborhood because you people won't do your jobs properly." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Brooks weighing his options, probably thinking about departmental policies and liability issues while trying to keep everyone satisfied. "Mr. Harrison," Brooks said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "would you be willing to submit to a brief pat-down search? It's completely voluntary, but it would help us close this matter definitively." I could have refused, probably should have refused, but something about Karen's smug expression made me want to see how far she was willing to push this charade. "No problem at all, officer," I replied, moving toward the patrol car and assuming the position against the hood with the practiced ease of someone who'd been through this procedure before. Brooks approached professionally, his hands moving efficiently as he checked for weapons or contraband. But when he asked me to lift my arms, I decided it was time to change the game entirely. I slowly pulled my shirt up over my head, revealing the intricate tattoo that covered most of my right shoulder and upper arm. The design was complex and unmistakable, a geometric pattern surrounding symbols that most people would never recognize, but that meant everything to those who knew what to look for. Brooks froze mid-motion, his hands stopping inches from my skin as his eyes widened with recognition and something that looked very much like fear. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, stepping back instinctively. He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the damage was already done. Karen, who had been watching with triumphant anticipation, suddenly found herself staring at something that made no sense in her carefully organized world of suburban power games and HOA politics. "What is that?" she demanded, leaning closer to get a better look at the tattoo that had just transformed a routine police call into something much more complicated. "What's happening here? Why aren't you arresting him?" But Brooks was already backing away, his professional demeanor replaced by the kind of respect that came from recognizing something far beyond his pay grade. The symbols on my shoulder told a story that very few people were authorized to know, and Detective Riley Brooks was one of the lucky few who understood exactly what he was looking at. I pulled my shirt back down and turned to face Karen directly, letting her see the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing you held all the cards in a game your opponent didn't even realize they were playing. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough edge to cut through her confusion. "Are you sure you want to continue this particular game? Because once we start playing by my rules, you might not like how it ends." Brooks pulled me aside while Martinez tried to calm down an increasingly agitated Karen, who kept demanding explanations that nobody seemed willing to give her. "Tank," he said quietly, using a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in this neighborhood for over 2 years. "What the hell are you doing here?" The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity, and I could see him piecing together implications that went far beyond suburban property disputes. "Just trying to live quietly, Riley," I replied, keeping my voice low. "The VA doc said I needed peace after the last deployment, and this seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while." The truth was more complicated than that, but Brooks didn't need to know about the chronic pain from the IED explosion that had ended my career or the PTSD episodes that still woke me up screaming some nights. Before I could elaborate, Karen reappeared with backup in the form of Councilman Derek Stone, a nervous little man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Stone approached us with a briefcase full of official-looking documents, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to project authority he didn't feel. "Officers," he announced, "I have here an emergency community health ordinance that requires immediate compliance from all property owners in this district. Mr. Harrison has 48 hours to bring his property into compliance or face eminent domain proceedings." He handed Brooks a stack of papers that looked impressive at first glance, but I caught several details that didn't quite add up. "These documents," I said, taking them from Brooks and examining them more closely, "seem to have some irregularities. This ordinance number doesn't match the county format, and I'm pretty sure that seal expired about 3 years ago." Stone's face went pale, and he started stammering about administrative errors and updated procedures, but his credibility was already shot. Karen looked furious, clearly not expecting her legal pressure campaign to fall apart so quickly, and I could see her recalculating her approach with the frustrated efficiency of someone whose plan A had just become completely worthless. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching the entire drama unfold from her front porch, called out cheerfully, "You know, that's funny about those papers because the Johnson family had the same problem about 6 months ago, right before they disappeared." Then Amy found the crack in Karen's armor, and it was criminal. The comment dropped into our conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond what Mrs. Henderson probably intended. Brooks immediately sharpened his attention, his cop instincts kicking in at the mention of missing persons, while Karen and Stone exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. "What do you mean disappeared?" Brooks asked, pulling out his notebook and switching into full investigation mode. Mrs. Henderson seemed delighted to finally have an audience for information she'd been storing up for months. "Well, the Johnsons lived in that blue house down by the corner. Nice family with 2 kids. Been here about 5 years. Patricia there came around with the same kinds of papers, same kinds of threats about compliance and community standards. And next thing you know, they'd sold their house and moved away without saying goodbye to anyone." The implications of that statement settled over me like a cold blanket, and I felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the only person in a position to prevent a catastrophe. Through my binoculars, I watched Petra and her associate walk the perimeter of the construction site, gesturing towards specific locations and consulting what appeared to be detailed architectural plans. The excavation was much more extensive than I'd realized, with multiple tunnel entrances and sophisticated ventilation systems that suggested a permanent underground facility rather than temporary construction. This wasn't just a smuggling operation or a money laundering scheme. This was infrastructure for something that would require sustained operations and the ability to move large amounts of equipment without detection. "Sophia," I said, my voice carrying the weight of terrible certainty, "I think she's building a staging area for an attack on the Capitol. The tunnels, the location, the timing, it all fits the pattern for a major terrorist operation." "Marcus," Sophia replied, her voice tight with stress, "we're mobilizing a response team, but it's going to take time to coordinate with local authorities and get the necessary approvals for federal intervention. Can you maintain surveillance without compromising your position?" I looked out at Petra Kozlov, the woman who'd killed my teammates and destroyed my career, now operating freely in American suburbia while planning God knows what kind of attack on innocent people. "Sophia," I said, feeling the old familiar calm settle over me as I prepared for what was coming next. "I think it's time to stop pretending I'm just a disabled veteran who wants to be left alone." I stopped pretending to be a harmless disabled veteran. At exactly 9:37 a.m., when Petra Kozlov's tactical team surrounded my property with military precision, through my workshop window, I counted 8 operatives moving through the tree lane, all carrying suppressed weapons and wearing tactical gear that wasn't available to civilians. They thought they were hunting a broken-down carpenter who'd stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen. But they were about to discover that some ghosts from the past had very long memories and very specific skill sets. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched them deploy around my cabin, because 5 years ago in Montenegro, I'd been the one hunting Petra Kozlov, and now she'd brought the fight directly to my front door. The first mistake they made was underestimating the terrain advantage of someone who'd spent 2 years preparing this property for exactly this kind of scenario. Every tree, every sightline, every potential cover position had been carefully evaluated and modified to favor a single defender against multiple attackers. The workshop wasn't just a place to build furniture, it was a hardened position with reinforced walls, multiple escape routes, and enough supplies to withstand a prolonged siege. The second mistake was assuming that Marcus Harrison, disabled veteran, was the same person they'd be fighting. Marcus Harrison was a cover identity, a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide the fact that the Ghost, one of the most effective counterterrorism operators in federal service, had never actually retired. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out as the first shot shattered my workshop windows. "Get down in your basement and stay there until this is over." God bless that woman. She waved at me from her kitchen window before disappearing, probably thinking this was just another exciting episode in the ongoing drama of her neighborhood. The attackers were using professional small unit tactics, advancing by fire and movement while attempting to establish overlapping fields of fire around my position. But they'd made the fatal error of treating this like a standard elimination operation against a civilian target, when what they were facing was a defensive position prepared by someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare. I triggered the first of my prepared surprises when the lead team reached the workshop perimeter, using Mrs. Henderson's garden gnomes as improvised explosive devices that I'd been preparing for months. The ceramic lawn ornaments contained enough homemade thermite to turn advancing operatives into very surprised casualties, and the psychological effect of being attacked by exploding garden decorations was worth almost as much as the tactical advantage. "Surprise, motherfuckers," I muttered, watching through my scope as Petra's carefully planned assault turned into chaos and confusion. The second wave of attackers tried to advance through the smoke and debris, but they ran into the field of concealed obstacles that turned my front yard into a lethal maze of improvised anti-personnel devices. Petra herself appeared at the edge of the tree lane, screaming orders in Russian and trying to regain control of an operation that was rapidly spiraling out of her control. She was wearing tactical gear now instead of her suburban soccer mom disguise, and the transformation was complete enough to confirm everything I'd suspected about her real identity and capabilities. "Marcus Harrison," she shouted across the battlefield, her voice carrying the kind of rage that came from realizing you'd been outmaneuvered by someone you'd underestimated. "You think you can hide behind your little veteran act? I know exactly who you are, Ghost. Come out and face me like the soldier you used to be." The use of my operational call sign sent a chill down my spine because it meant she'd known my real identity from the beginning, probably before I'd even moved to Lake Vista Estates. This entire situation, from the property dispute to the police involvement, had been an elaborate trap designed to flush me out of hiding and eliminate the one person who could identify her and destroy her carefully constructed new life. But what Petra didn't know was that the Ghost had never actually gone into hiding. He'd just been waiting for exactly the right moment to complete unfinished business from Montenegro. Every aspect of my civilian cover, from the disability payments to the woodworking hobby, had been designed to create the perfect operational environment for a final confrontation with the woman who'd killed my team. Detective Brooks chose that moment to arrive on the scene with backup, probably responding to reports of gunfire and explosions in a quiet residential neighborhood. What he found was something that looked more like urban warfare than suburban property disputes, with smoke rising from my front yard and tactical operatives scattered around my property in various states of injury and confusion. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," he shouted from behind his patrol car. "What the hell is going on here?" But before I could answer, one of Petra's remaining operatives made the mistake of taking a shot at a police officer, which transformed my personal vendetta into an official law enforcement incident with federal implications. "Brooks," I called out, "you need to get on the radio right now and tell whoever's listening that Petra Kozlov, international terrorist, is operating on American soil with a full tactical team. This isn't a property dispute anymore. This is a federal counterterrorism operation." I could see him processing the information, probably wondering how his quiet suburban beat had suddenly turned into something out of an action movie. But to his credit, He got on the radio immediately and started calling for every kind of backup the county could provide. Mrs. Henderson, meanwhile, had decided that hiding in her basement was boring because she was now live streaming the entire battle on Facebook with commentary that was both hilarious and surprisingly accurate. Y'all, she announced to her rapidly growing online audience, World War III just started in my backyard, and let me tell you, Marcus is handling it like a professional. That Patricia woman has been nothing but trouble since she moved here, and now she's got herself a whole army trying to mess with the wrong veteran. The live stream was going viral in real time, with thousands of viewers watching a 72-year-old grandmother provide color commentary on a federal counterterrorism operation. Oh, and there goes another one of those garden gnomes. Marcus, honey, you're going to owe me for my decorations, but this is better than cable television. The tactical situation was rapidly shifting in my favor, but Petra wasn't finished yet. She pulled back her remaining operatives and was coordinating what looked like a final assault on my position, probably hoping to eliminate me before federal reinforcements could arrive. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation in her planning, because Detective Riley Brooks wasn't just a local cop who'd happened to recognize my tattoo. Marcus, he called out during a brief lull in the fighting. Phoenix sends her regards, and the cavalry is about 3 minutes out. The revelation that Brooks was also federal, probably FBI or DHS, meant that this entire situation had been under surveillance from multiple angles, and Petra's carefully planned operation was about to become a complete disaster. Petra, I shouted across the battlefield, stepping out of my fortified position for the first time since the fighting started. This ends now. You killed my team in Montenegro, you've been hiding in my country for 5 years, and you just made the mistake of bringing this fight to my home. She appeared at the edge of the tree lean, her weapon raised, and for a moment we faced each other across 20 yards of devastated suburbia, like something out of an old Western movie. Ghost, she replied, her voice carrying years of hatred and frustration. You cost me everything in Montenegro. My organization, my reputation, my son who died in that raid. This has been 5 years in the making, and I'm going to finish what we started. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, and both of us knew that our personal war was about to become a federal incident with international implications. The federal helicopters touched down in Mrs. Henderson's backyard at exactly 10:43 a.m., disgorging a tactical response team that moved with the kind of precision that made Petra's operatives look like amateur hour. Sophia Martinez stepped out of the lead aircraft wearing full tactical gear and the expression of someone who'd been waiting 5 years for this moment. Ghost, she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of rotor blades and distant sirens. We've got this locked down. Stand down and let us finish the job. But Petra wasn't going to surrender quietly, and the look in her eyes told me that she'd rather die fighting than spend the rest of her life in a federal supermax prison explaining her activities to counterterrorism investigators. You think this changes anything? Petra shouted, backing toward the construction site with her remaining operatives providing covering fire. I've spent 5 years building something that your government can't stop. And killing one broken veteran isn't going to prevent what's coming next. She was retreating toward the tunnel system that she'd been constructing under the cover of her Lake Villa development, probably hoping to escape through underground passages that led to predetermined extraction points. But what she didn't know was that federal surveillance had been tracking her construction activities for months, and every tunnel, every exit, every possible escape route had been mapped and secured by teams that were already in position. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place as I watched her retreat, and I realized that my entire civilian existence in Lake Vista estates had been an elaborate federal sting operation designed to draw Petra Kozlov out of hiding. The property deed that had brought me here wasn't just a veteran's disability benefit. It was bait carefully placed by people who understood exactly how international terrorists thought and operated. My cover identity as Marcus Harrison, disabled veteran and weekend carpenter, had been so perfect that even I'd started to believe it was real. But the truth was that the ghost had never actually retired from federal service. Sophia, I called out, advancing toward Petra's position with the tactical support of agents who'd been preparing for this operation longer than I'd realized. She's heading for the tunnel system. The construction site is a full underground facility with multiple escape routes and probably enough weapons to supply a small army. Petra turned at the sound of my voice, her weapon raised, and for a moment we faced each other across a battlefield that looked more like a war zone than suburban Georgia. "Marcus," she screamed, her voice carrying years of hatred and frustration. "You destroyed my life, my organization, my family. My son died because of your raid in Montenegro." The revelation hit me like a physical blow because I suddenly understood the personal motivation behind 5 years of careful planning and patient preparation. This wasn't just about terrorism or money or political ideology. This was about a mother's revenge for a child lost in the chaos of international intelligence operations. "Petra," I said, lowering my weapon slightly. "I'm sorry about your son. War is hell, and innocent people die when the shooting starts. But that doesn't justify 5 years of planning attacks on American civilians who had nothing to do with what happened in Montenegro." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the conflict between her need for revenge and the realization that her carefully constructed new life was collapsing around her. The standoff ended when federal agents emerged from the tunnel system behind her, having infiltrated the underground facility through access points that she didn't know had been discovered months ago. Petra Kozlov, international arms dealer and terrorist coordinator, surrendered without firing another shot, probably realizing that her 5-year game of cat and mouse had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Karen's lawyer smirked at our slim folder. Their binders towered like a wall of lies. Little did they know, we had brought a grenade. "You think you've won," she said as the agents secured her weapons and began the arrest procedure. But I was just one piece of a much larger operation. There are others, people you'll never find, and they'll finish what I started. But the defiance in her voice was hollow now, the desperate bravado of someone who'd just watched their entire world collapse in real time. Sophia approached me as the tactical team secured the area and began the complex process of documenting what was probably the largest counterterrorism operation on domestic soil in recent history. "Marcus," she said, pulling off her tactical helmet and looking at me with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's over. Petra's network has been under surveillance for 2 years, and today's operation netted 17 arrests across 6 states. The threat is neutralized, and you can finally have that peaceful retirement you've been pretending to want." I looked around at the devastation that had once been my quiet lakefront property, then over at Mrs. Henderson, who was still live streaming the federal response to her thousands of online viewers. Well, Mrs. Henderson announced to her rapidly growing social media audience that was the most excitement this neighborhood has seen since the Johnson's dog got loose and terrorized the mailman. "Marcus, honey, you're going to be famous after this, and I hope you know you're welcome at my bridge club anytime you want to tell war stories." The absurdity of the situation, combined with the adrenaline crash that followed any major operation, made me laugh for the first time in longer than I could remember. Petra Kozlov was in federal custody, her terrorist network was dismantled, and suburban Georgia was safe from international conspiracies, at least for the foreseeable future. The gavel cracked. Dismissed with prejudice. Karen's face went sheet white, but the judge wasn't done. "Mrs. Goodson, you've committed perjury, and this court recommends criminal charges." 6 months later, I was back in my workshop, rebuilding the oak chest that had been destroyed in the firefight and enjoying the kind of peaceful retirement that I'd been pretending to want for the past 2 years. The official story, according to federal press releases, was that an international fugitive had been captured following an extensive investigation by multiple agencies. My role in the operation remained classified, and Marcus Harrison, disabled veteran and part-time carpenter, continued to live quietly by the lake while the ghost officially retired from federal service. Mrs. Henderson's live stream had made her an internet celebrity, and she'd parlayed her 15 minutes of fame into a cable television deal that kept her busy and happy. Karen lost her presidency, her real estate license, and her freedom facade. As for us, we're back on our porch, watching the pines sway, our fire pit crackling defiantly. Bullies bet you'll cave. But sometimes, the quietest land fights back the hardest. Sometimes the best ending to a long war is simply the chance to go home and build something beautiful with your own hands, knowing that the people you care about are safe and the ghosts from your past have finally been laid to rest. We all fear being powerless when bullies target what we love most. Whether it's your home, family, or dreams, that sinking feeling when someone with authority tries to steal what's rightfully yours is universal. But like Marcus proved, sometimes the quiet ones pack the biggest punch. Your story of standing up to injustice matters too. If this tale of hidden strength and sweet revenge resonated with your own battles, smash that like button and subscribe to HOA Unfiltered because everyone deserves to see the underdog win. What's your don't mess with me moment? Share below. From all of us at HOA Unfiltered, thank you for watching and resisting the HOA overlords. Our team will be back with more tales of property warfare and community betrayal. Until then, keep your defenses up, literally. 2. People move all the time, Karen interjected quickly. But there was something defensive in her tone that made Brooks lean forward with increased interest. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished with her story, and the details she provided painted a picture that was starting to look distinctly uncomfortable for everyone involved. Funny thing is, she continued, I tried to send them a Christmas card last year, but the forwarding address they left was for a vacant lot in Alabama. Post office said nobody by that name had ever lived there. And when I tried to look them up online, it was like the Johnson family had never existed at all. The implications of that statement hung in the air like smoke, and I could see Brooks making mental notes about missing persons reports and suspicious disappearances. As if summoned by our conversation, the sound of heavy machinery drifted across the lake from the construction site. The kind of industrial noise that seemed oddly out of place for a residential development project. The equipment was running despite it being late afternoon on a weekday, and the workers appeared to be using sound-dampening barriers that seemed excessive for normal construction activities. Brooks noticed the noise too, his head turning toward the lake with the automatic attention of someone trained to notice details that didn't quite fit expected patterns. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, what exactly is being built over there? The permits I've seen mention lake villas, but that sounds like pretty heavy excavation work for residential construction. Karen's answer came just a beat too quickly, with the kind of practiced smoothness that suggested she'd rehearsed this explanation multiple times. It's a very exclusive development, officer, with extensive landscaping and underground utilities that require specialized equipment. My investors spare no expense when it comes to quality construction. But even as she spoke, I was noticing other details that didn't quite add up, like the fact that the soil being removed from the site was being loaded into sealed containers rather than standard dump trucks, and that the work seemed to be happening exclusively during hours when most residents wouldn't be paying attention. Something was wrong with this picture, and I was starting to suspect that Patricia Whitmore's Lake Villa project was covering up something much more interesting than suburban real estate development. Stone kept checking his watch like he was late for an important appointment somewhere else, sweat beading on his forehead despite the mild weather. The fake documents, the missing neighbors, the suspicious construction work, it was all starting to form a pattern that made my old instincts tingle with warning signals. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was something bigger and potentially much more dangerous. Well, Brooks said finally, closing his notebook and looking at all of us with the expression of someone who just realized his simple property dispute call had turned into the opening act of something much bigger. I think we've covered everything we need to for today. Mr. Harrison, thank you for your cooperation. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Stone, we'll be in touch if we need any additional information. As the group began to break up, I caught Brooks looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, probably wondering exactly what he'd stumbled into and whether he was equipped to handle whatever came next. That evening, as I sat in my workshop pretending to focus on sanding the oak chest, my phone started buzzing with notifications that made my blood run cold. Someone had been busy creating a very unflattering digital portrait of Marcus Harrison, disabled veteran and small business owner. My Google search results now included a fabricated criminal record showing arrests for domestic violence, drug possession, and threatening behavior toward neighbors. The fake mugshots looked convincing enough to fool casual observers, and the arrest dates were spread out over several years to create a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior. Whoever had orchestrated this character assassination knew exactly what they were doing, and they had access to resources that went far beyond typical HOA revenge tactics. The sophistication of the attack was what caught my attention, though. This wasn't some amateur hour smear campaign thrown together by an angry homeowner with basic computer skills. The fake records were integrated into multiple databases, the documentation looked professionally forged, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone with serious technical capabilities had spent considerable time and effort preparing this digital trap, waiting for exactly the right moment to spring it. I fired up my laptop and started tracing the digital breadcrumbs using skills that I'd hoped never to need again in civilian life. The IP addresses led through a maze of proxy servers and encrypted connections, but the pattern was familiar enough to make my hands shake slightly as I followed the trail deeper into cyberspace. Within an hour, I'd identified the source of the attack as a network that had previously been linked to Eastern European cyber criminal organizations, the same groups that specialized in identity theft, financial fraud, and information warfare. The techniques were too advanced for local criminals, and the coordination suggested an operation with international backing and professional-level planning. This wasn't Patricia Whitmore playing suburban power games anymore. This was something that belonged in classified briefings and federal task force meetings. I encrypted my findings and sent them to a secure email address that hadn't been used in over 2 years, hoping that the recipient would still be monitoring it and willing to help an old colleague who'd stumbled into something much bigger than expected. The response came back within minutes, faster than I dared to hope, and the message was both reassuring and terrifying in its implications. Tink. We've been tracking unusual cyber activity in your area for the past 6 months. Network matches known terrorist support infrastructure. Suggest immediate contact for coordination. Stay low until we can assess the threat level. Phoenix. Sophia Martinez, my former partner in more classified operations than either of us cared to remember, was still in the game and still using our old communication protocols. The fact that she was already aware of activities in my neighborhood meant that this situation had been on federal radar long before Patricia Whitmore had started threatening me with fake legal documents. My phone rang at exactly midnight, and I answered it with the secure communication app that I'd never quite gotten around to deleting from my device. Marcus. Sophia's voice was exactly as I remembered it, professionally calm with an undercurrent of barely controlled intensity. We need to talk. The woman calling herself Patricia Whitmore has been on our watch list for over a year, but we've never been able to get close enough to gather actionable intelligence. Your little property dispute might be exactly the opening we've been waiting for. The implications of her statement hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the familiar mixture of adrenaline and dread that had defined too many nights in too many dangerous places around the world. Sophia, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. I'm supposed to be retired. The VA doctors said I needed peace, not federal operations and international conspiracies. Her laugh was short and bitter, carrying the weight of shared experiences that civilians would never understand. Marcus, you bought property in the exact location where we suspected she'd eventually surface. You've been living there for exactly the right amount of time to establish credibility, and your cover story is so perfect that even I didn't know you were there until tonight. Either you're the luckiest retired operative in history, or someone much smarter than both of us has been playing a very long game. The possibility that my entire civilian existence had been orchestrated by people with agendas I didn't understand was both infuriating and oddly comforting in its familiarity. While we talked, I monitored the cyber attacks in real time, watching as my fake criminal records spread across social media platforms and local community forums. Karen's supporters were sharing the fabricated information with the righteous enthusiasm of people who believed they were protecting their neighborhood from a dangerous individual. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, was fighting back in the comments sections with the ferocity of someone who'd taken personal offense at the attack on her neighbor. "This is fake news," she posted repeatedly. And anyone with half a brain can see that Marcus has been nothing but helpful and polite since he moved here. Y'all should be ashamed of yourselves for spreading lies about a veteran who served his country. The good news, Sophia continued, is that we now have probable cause to investigate Mrs. Whitmore's operation more aggressively. The cyber attack on you constitutes a federal crime, and we can use that as justification for surveillance and eventual intervention. The bad news is that we think she's planning something much bigger than real estate fraud, and your property appears to be a critical component of whatever she's got in mind. Brooks called while I was still on the secure line with Sophia, his voice tense with the kind of stress that came from realizing that a routine police call had opened a door into something far beyond local jurisdiction. Marcus, he said without preamble, I've been getting calls all evening about your criminal record. But when I try to verify the information through official channels, none of it shows up in any legitimate database. Someone's playing games with serious technology, and I'm starting to think we're all in over our heads. I glanced out my window toward the construction site where work lights were burning bright despite the late hour and made a decision that would either end this nightmare or make it infinitely worse. Riley, I said, I think it's time we all had a conversation about what's going on around here. Tomorrow morning, my place, and bring everything you've got on Patricia Whitmore and her development project. The meeting with Brooks never happened. At 6 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy equipment moving closer to my property line. And when I looked out the window, I saw Patricia Whitmore standing next to a man I'd never seen before, pointing directly at my cabin while speaking rapidly in what sounded like Russian. The stranger was tall, athletic, and carried himself with the kind of disciplined posture that screamed military training from a mile away. He wore expensive civilian clothes, but the way he scanned my property was pure tactical assessment, the kind of professional observation that came from years of planning operations in hostile territory. This wasn't some Eastern European investor interested in lake villas. This was an operator, and his presence here meant that whatever Patricia had been planning was about to move into a much more dangerous phase. I grabbed my binoculars and settled into a concealed observation post I'd prepared months ago, using techniques that felt as natural as breathing despite my supposed retirement from that kind of work. Through the lenses, I could see Patricia's face clearly for the first time without the carefully applied makeup and practiced suburban smile. And what I saw made my blood run cold. The bone structure was wrong for someone named Patricia Whitmore. The facial proportions suggested Eastern European ancestry, and there was a distinctive scar along her left jawline that had been expertly concealed, but was visible in the harsh morning light. I'd seen that face before in classified briefings and intelligence photographs, belonging to someone who was supposed to be dead for the past 5 years. Petr Kozlov, international arms dealer and terrorist coordinator, had been presumed killed in a CIA raid on a compound in Montenegro back in 2019. The operation had been a joint task force effort, and I'd been part of the team that had provided tactical support for the assault. We'd found evidence of her presence, blood that had matched her DNA profile, and enough circumstantial evidence to convince everyone that she'd been eliminated along with most of her organization. But intelligence work was full of presumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. And looking at her now, very much alive and operating in suburban Georgia, I realized that someone had been played by a master manipulator who'd spent years building the perfect cover identity. The memories hit me like a physical blow, dragging me back to that night in Montenegro when everything had gone wrong. Petra's organization had been responsible for supplying weapons to terrorist cells across 3 continents, and the raid was supposed to end her network permanently. Instead, we'd walked into a trap that had cost us 3 team members and nearly gotten me killed by the IED explosion that had ended my career. The shrapnel in my legs started aching with phantom pain as I remembered the sound of the blast, the screams of my teammates, and the realization that we'd been betrayed by someone with access to our operational plans. Petra had always been known for her intelligence and ruthlessness, but the level of planning required to fake her death and establish a new identity in America was beyond anything we'd credited her with. My hands were shaking as I called Sophia on the secure line, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through the implications of what I'd discovered. Phoenix, we have a problem. Patricia Whitmore is Petr Kozlov, and she's very much alive. I'm looking at her right now, and she's got what appears to be a full operational team preparing for something big. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for me to wonder if the connection had been lost. But when Sophia finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of controlled tension that meant she was already mentally shifting into crisis management mode. Marcus, are you certain about the identification? Petrick Hasloff has been officially dead for 5 years, and if you're wrong about this, we're about to trigger a massive federal response based on the PTSD hallucinations of a disabled veteran. The accusation stung, partly because I'd wondered the same thing myself, but the evidence was too clear to ignore. Sophia, I know what I saw in Montenegro, and I know what I'm seeing now. Same facial structure, same scar, same way of moving when she thinks nobody's watching. Either Petrick Hasloff has an identical twin who happens to be running suspicious operations in the exact location where a dead terrorist would logically want to establish a new base, or we've been chasing a ghost who's been laughing at us for 5 years. I could hear Sophia typing rapidly on her computer, probably accessing classified databases and cross-referencing intelligence reports that would either confirm my identification or prove that I'd finally lost my mind completely. Jesus Christ, she whispered after several minutes of silence. You're right. Facial recognition software confirms a 96% match, and the timeline fits perfectly with when she disappeared from Montenegro. Marcus, if Petrick Hasloff has been operating in the United States for 5 years under a perfect cover identity, then whatever she's planning is going to be bigger than anything we've seen before. Her specialty was always coordinated attacks on government infrastructure, and your property is less than 2 hours from Washington, D.C. with direct highway access and minimal security oversight.